And in a moment, our political commentators are with us on developments this morning. The Labour leader Chris Hipkins has been outlining details of the party's capital gains tax policy, which will campaign on ahead of the next election. It was announced abruptly this morning after RNZ was earlier leaked details over the long weekend. The policy will cover the sale of commercial and residential properties, excluding the family home and farms. The tax will be set at 28%. The policy will kick in from July 2027 and would not be retrospective. And the tax money raised would go to fund 3 free doctor's visits per year. Craig McCulloch is RNZ's acting political editor. He broke the story. He's been at the media conference fronted by Labour's leader, finance spokesman and health spokesperson, which has just wrapped up. Morning, Craig.
Good morning, Catherine.
Let's start with the policy. What are the details beyond what I've just outlined there?
Big picture, what we are talking here about is a targeted CGT. I know that there's some dispute over just how narrow it is. Nicola Willis claiming that it is a massive tax, not a narrow one. The fact of the matter is, it is quite a narrow tax when you consider what a CGT could conceivably cover. This one covers only property, commercial and residential property, not the family home and not farms. So no shares, no inheritance, no KiwiSaver, none of those personal assets like
cars, boats, art, furniture,
artwork, etc.
Yep.
To be clear, the family batch here would be covered, and so would rental properties that are making a loss. Any property outside the family home or farms. It's quite similar to the minority recommendation from the 2019 tax working group. If people cast their minds back to that, it's a sort of an extension to the existing bright line test. The headline information, 28% in line with the company tax rate. It kicks in from July the 1st, 2027. That will be known as valuation day, so it's only gains after that point which will be taxed. And in terms of the revenue, here is the latest information that we have just had from the media conference. It starts quite small, as it does with all capital gains taxes, because of course the revenue is only collected at the point of sale. Over the forecast period, it is estimated to raise an average of $700 million a year. It starts at $100 million in the first year, moves to $385 million, then $965 million, and then eventually in that fourth year, $1.3 billion. Of course, these are just projections.
Yeah, and it needs the property to appreciate, of course, which we know it has done at various times in the past.
But not recently.
Not recently, all right. Okay, so look, that's one aspect of it. The second thing they have done is be very specific about where any taxes raised from this policy will be spent. It's a little unusual in some ways, isn't it, to be so specific. It's not just going to the consolidated fund to pay for everything. They've ring-fenced it essentially, have they?
Well, to some degree, yes, although it's a little bit of an accounting trick. They're talking about all the money going into the health system. Now, of course, that's quite easy to say because the health system is enormous and consumes an enormous chunk of change. So therefore, it's quite simple to say, we'll take this money and we'll put it there. It's not, as far as I can tell, explicitly ring-fenced. But there is this Metacard scheme. And that is an interesting component because there's this card which will be issued to all New Zealanders linked in with existing GP systems. It would offer New Zealanders 3 free GP visits a year. And the thinking, I mean, obviously they're from a political marketing perspective, voters are keenly interested right now in the cost of living. They're keenly interested in healthcare. Maybe they're more sceptical about tax. So by tying them together, Labour's saying, here's a new tax, but here is what you can get in return.
It's interesting. I remember a former finance minister, quite a famous one for Labour, arguing when he was criticised of borrowing for the super fund. Well, look, the tax take is the tax take. You can't be specific about whether a tax is being spent for a purpose or not.
Right.
So I take your point. But what they have announced at the same time is our new health policy, right? And they're saying this is a way, this is going to help us finance it, yeah?
Indeed. There are some questions, though, still around that Metacard scheme. For example, why the universality, for example? Why no means testing? Poorer people need the doctor more frequently than richer people. We know that. Richer people presumably can afford to pay for their GP visits already. I asked Aisha Verrill about that at the media conference. Why did they opt for this? She said the targeted approach which is currently used under the healthcare system, is clearly not working. She says still 1 in 6 people are missing out, and so therefore they've opted for the universality. The other question, of course, is around capacity and whether or not there's even the resource there to take care of that increased demand. They seem to think that there will be, and they're providing extra funding for GPs to cover that.
I mean, that's interesting. Just a quick aside, there was another accidental release of a policy last week, was there not? When they're actually talking about something I know the GPs will be very interested in, which is an independent body to set what their kind of funding rates are, their capitation rates are.
That's right, and very much related to this. In fact, there's more detail about that in the discussion document which we've been provided this morning, although I don't have all the details directly in front of me.
It's just interesting that we've had 2 accidental releases. More on that in a moment. First, why CGT over other options? And, this is going to come to our conversation in a moment about whether there's some people frustrated with this. It's not only a CGT, it is fairly targeted. It doesn't include farms, for example. The family home would have been a brave move, but a lot of people will say a CGT only truly becomes effective when that is in there as well, as a source of a large amount of tax, and exclusions for these other things.
This was the big debate in the party. They have been locked in an internal debate for months over tax, whether or not to go for the wealth tax or the CGT. It has not been an easy conversation. In fact, you could say it's been a rather fraught one. Proponents of the CGT see it as the much safer option politically. New Zealanders already very familiar with the idea. They are used all over the world. New Zealand is unusual in the fact that it does not have one. Increasingly quite mainstream. For example, you have Treasury in support, some rich listers coming out, bank executives. This is not a radical left-wing idea. And so the argument is that it would be an easier sell as well, like you say, very narrow in terms of just property. So there aren't all the same complications which can crop up around, say, when you include KiwiSaver or shares or other assets. On the other hand, a wealth tax, which was the other proposal, it's more novel, it's not so common overseas, not a typical talking point here, arguably riskier. Barbara Edmonds today said she wasn't convinced that it would work unless Australia adopted something similar. She said that there would just be wealth flight. So arguably riskier. Its proponents, of course, they say they think it is better because it can be targeted to fewer people, the very richest. Theoretically, it can raise more money because it's paid regularly, like rates, rather than at the point of sale. Those are the points in favour. Ultimately, though, Labour has settled on this more mainstream option, which I should say as well was also the leader's preference. No doubt that's played a bit of a part in ending up here.
This is the leader who put the kibosh on a former finance minister's tax switch in advance of the 2023 election. And had what was it called? The bonfire of the policy bonfire. So this is what I want to come to next. Now, I have no knowledge of how the story broke, Craig, other than what I've heard on the radio. But can we be clear? Was this a deliberate and intended leak to you by a source we will be speculating from within the party? Was this a disgruntled leak?
Obviously, I am not going to reveal any details about the source of the information, but I can say it was not an accidental leak, and that I did not stumble across this in a dropped notepad or something.
You weren't nagging away, had the kind of story and got a nod and a wink. We know where I'm coming from. Was this a deliberate leak?
I'll say it was an accidental, Catherine.
Right,
I don't want to go into too much detail just to protect my source.
Fair enough. Okay.
It does show, I think, though, that Labour's policy machine is not necessarily the well-oiled machine just yet. I mean, we saw last week a few slip-ups, a bit thin on the detail around the Future Fund, a bit sloppy around that GP funding policy, and now this leak, a leak around its biggest policy to date, arguably the biggest of its entire platform. I mean, in terms of the impact, it could be potentially destabilising for the party, which has otherwise been quite stable since the election.
You had the leader having to cancel his regular morning report segment this morning because they clearly needed to scramble. Again, I don't have knowledge of this. I don't have any inside knowledge of this. I'm just following this like any other, RNZ listener or viewer. But here he is. He has cancelled his regular segment. 3 of them together for a hurried media conference explaining it. And now some of the political questions will be over the how. Now, look, it can be just a cock-up, or it can be a conspiracy, again to quote Michael Cullen. And we'll talk to our political commentators about their theories on that. What have been the reactions generally from others, Craig, from other parties?
Look, the governing parties have been eagerly awaiting this. They see this as a potential turning point and opportunity. Labour has been rising in the polls despite having quite little in the way of a policy platform. So they have been hoping, the government parties have been hoping that once these proposals are all made public, the voters start to digest them, they will be spooked back into the government arms. A lot of enthusiasm coming out of National this morning. Nicola Willis firing, calling it a terrible idea and a massive tax which would hit many businesses. You've got David Seymour calling it divisive. New Zealand First calling it a train wreck and also talking up the fact it has been leaked. On that point of it being leaked, less than ideal. Labour had intended to announce it later this week in a much more managed way. Which
brings us back to perhaps potentially cock up over conspiracy. It's not like something they were necessarily going to sit on for weeks more. Your understanding is it was to be announced later this week.
It was to be announced later this week. This morning, Chris Hipkins was asked about that. He was trying to downplay it somewhat, but he did say If they found out who it was who leaked it, they would no longer be a member of the Labour Party. Now, he said there are a lot of people involved in the construction of this policy, and he's not interested in investigating it, so seems, well, unlikely that they'll figure out who it was.
All right, thanks for that.
They're certainly not finding out from me.
Yeah, I completely understand and respect that. Thank you very much. Craig McCulloch is RNZ's political editor. We're listening in our political commentators, Brigitte, Morten and Neale Jones. Morning both.
Good morning.
Brigitte is a director with public and commercial law firm Frank Zogby, former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government and a National Party member who campaigns during elections for the party's deputy leader Nicola Willis. Neale Jones, chief of staff to Labour leader Jacinda Ardern, prior to that to Andrew Little, director of public affairs firm Capital, and has just actually been supporting Andrew Little's campaign for mayor. That point I made there in putting Craig on the spot does matter as to the motivation for this, whether it was just someone getting too excited or whether it was someone really annoyed at this policy.
In my experience, you never find the leaker, and I've been involved in the Labour leader's office when there were lots of leaks. I think with this policy, it is the end point of a 2-year debate in the party. The broad shape of it has been known for weeks. I've been hearing from lay members of the Labour Party about their views on this exact policy. And the final version was sent to, I believe, about 60 people, which was the entire caucus and the entire New Zealand Council, and it would have gone through Policy Council and others as well. So I think when you send it that widely,
there's a risk someone can't help themselves.
And it might not even be them. They might have sent it to a friend who then sent it on.
So the risk is someone can't help themselves with what they know.
So I don't want to sort of say there's some grand conspiracy when it might be relatively innocent.
It could be relatively simple. The question is then, is there any link to how annoyed some people might be over how limited this policy is? What is the mood?
Look, there's certainly been a very robust debate in the Labour Party. There was a group of people who wanted the wealth tax that Grant Robertson and David Parker proposed. There were certainly a lot of people who wanted a more comprehensive capital gains tax than has been announced. So there'll be a mix of views, and the party's quite strongly felt. That's the nature of a democratic, vibrant party. I do think that what's important now is that people get behind it. I mean, I'm of the relatively controversial view that the purpose of the New Zealand Labour Party is not to be a debating society, but to be a political party that wins power to implement policies that benefit New Zealand. And my view is actually that this package here is the most effective policy you could announce if you were trying to win power this election. You were trying to implement some form of CGT. You were going to raise revenue to try and fix our health system. I think they've actually nailed the policy politically.
I'd love to know, Brigitte, if this happens, whether National would ever repeal it, or those days are gone. They'd take the revenue in the future, wouldn't they?
Well, they've come out pretty strongly against it, and I think it's pretty easy for them to come out strongly against it because this policy actually, whilst tagged as narrow, it is undoubtedly not narrow. And I think what is missing here is actually looking into that commercial property side of it in particular. Exempting farms. Do we actually know what farms mean? Is that orchards? Is it market gardens? And we know most of our farm properties also have commercial properties on them too. Are you selling them all at once? And then you put aside also that we're a small business nation. And lots of our small businesses, our retiree plans are selling on those small businesses. They have commercial property elements to them as well. So I think the complexity in this is what's going to trip Labour over.
Can you explain that last bit about the small businesses and commercial?
So a lot of our small businesses, so if you're a plumber, it's very common to own the warehouse that you might store, your vans and your
some will lease, many,
but a lot do own. It's part of. I mean, we are a bit of a property nation. I think this is what it's targeted at. But that does mean that we are set up in a way that a lot of small business owners do own commercial property that they use. It becomes part of that deal, and I don't think it's correct to say that the 2019 working group actually recommended this because they were really clear that actually what you want to do is make sure that you don't tax business activities because they will be a dampener on economic activity. And that's the bit that seems to be missing from Labour's understanding about this policy. They think they're targeting, rich 65-year-olds with 10 rental properties. That's who they're going after. That's a landlord tax.
I can tell you now, there are others who are proponents of a wider tax who are now saying leaving farms out is the mistake. Because the flip side of it is, how much do you actually get? Here's the fundamental argument. We tax income. We tax the I think out of income,
this is what's clear.
But not assets.
Well, I think what's clear, though, is that, when the people are saying, moving farms out is a problem, the more exemptions you create to a policy like this, the more complications there are, the less, frankly, revenue comes from it. So, frankly, Labour is probably going to use this as a vehicle to expand over time because at the moment they're funding 3 GP visits out of this whole new tax.
Well, no,
Putting
that's just the start. As the revenue ramps up, there'll be far more money into the health system.
But that at the moment is what they can say, that they're actually funding from this. So I think you've got to be really clear that this is not the end of where Labour's policy is. This is not the narrowness. This is where
If we can
this
get
is the
back
start.
to debating the actual policy that's been announced and not ones that Brigitte wants to invent.
I'm not inventing them. I think it's never the Labour Party that's inventing them.
I'll take a bet with you now. There'll be no repeal of this if this gets bedded in over the next 5-6 years. I'll take a bet with you now on that.
So to go back to a few of those points, yes, some people might invest in commercial property as a retirement plan. You know what a lot of people do with their retirement plans? They save income, which is taxed. And this is the point. Workers pay tax on every dollar they earn, and businesses' profits, operating profits, they're not going to be taxed either. What will be taxed is at the end of it, if you've bought a building for your business, and after July 2027, which is when the tax actually starts accruing, if you make, say, $100,000 capital gain, you'll pay $28,000 in tax on that capital gain. I think that's entirely fair, just as your workers pay tax on their income and just as you do on the profits of your business. So I don't think that is particularly controversial. I don't think it's a particularly strong argument. It is just about taxing fairly. What's also important about this policy, I think, and I don't want to sound like I'm shilling because I was very worried about what they'd announced, and I think they've actually done it well, is that this is actually going to divert investment into the productive economy. So it does mean that if you've got a bit of spare cash sitting around, rather than going, I'm just going to plough them to property, which is unproductive.
How?
Yeah, I agree.
Because
How?
this is a key issue. The tax, the leveraging is not there for other investments, right? Okay, you want to buy a rental property, go and buy a rental property. Your bank will lend you 80 to 90% of it, and if there is another big question, if there is substantial capital gain, you're the beneficiary. It won't lend you money to go and invest. You'd be lucky if it lends you money to go and start a business.
I'm not claiming it's the solution to everything, but it will mean that at the margins, it is more attractive to invest in productive assets than it is in speculation on property.
But this is where I think we disagree, and this is what the point I'm trying to make earlier is I think that Labour, in the lack of detail, I'm just going on what they've put out there, haven't really actually examined what actually is the makeup of commercial property. That's the key element that I don't think they've looked at, and what that actually means for our productive economy, because as I go back to, we're a small, medium enterprise, and I do think, therefore, you can't say that suddenly this money is going to start flowing in productive assets. I don't believe that.
You're a lawyer, so explain to me now the growing number of offerings to take shares in commercial property, for example, or even shares starting to pop up now in rental property, so that you're not having to go and buy the whole property yourself. Would that currently be taxed? Would you be taxed on returns from a fund, for example?
Well, first of all, I think you probably want to talk to a tax advisor, not a public lawyer about this. I'm not going to give tax advice here. But I think this is what is missing. This is what is unclear in this policy, actually what the impact is on commercial activities. They've gone for the classic Labour positioning of, we're going to raise more tax and we're going to do that by taxing the rich, which we think is the rental.
Can I just say, though, that every time this comes up, that capital gains tax up, there's all these, what about this, what about that? It's not like this is new. Every other country in the world pretty much has a capital gains tax. Like, we already have a bright line test which we can build off. This is not new. There are very basic principles all around the world that we can follow, and with New Zealand we can follow. It's nothing new. It's nothing exciting. It's a very, very boring conventional tax, and it's the most stripped-back version you could possibly imagine.
I think the other issue is timing, and whether we see anything like the gains for rental property that there were over 10, 15, 20 years at the turn of the century. I mean, it may end up to be the biggest damp squib ever, given the holding costs now. You've got a whole generation of baby boomers who, if anything, are starting to get out of their rental properties. Another risk is that it actually raises bigger but we'll be waiting several years to answer that.
Yeah, I think there is a real risk that this is not going to raise its considerable revenue above the bright line test that we currently have. And therefore, there's a real question here about what Hipkins is doing in terms of political capital to go out with this kind of policy, lacking quite a lot of detail at this stage, and maybe he has a plan beyond of his rush policy this morning to get that level of detail out. But ultimately, at the moment, we've got kind of a half policy.
Final comment on it. He had to do something, right? Or he would have issues within his own party.
Yeah, there was a clear expectation from within the party that there would be some kind of tax on capital, and I think they've got that now. So that's a given. The other thing I think is that he does have to differentiate from National. You do have to provide hope that things can be better. And as I've been saying on this show in recent months, we are told repeatedly that Our health system, Treasury says there's a $10 billion gap. We see things getting worse. We're told we have to retire later. It seems everything is getting harder and we have no money and everything's impossible and everything has to get worse. And Labor had to find a way to say, things can be better. And I think this gives an opportunity to do that. In the out years beyond 2030, the revenue will increase quite substantially into the billions according to projections. And that will give an opportunity, I think, to start funding our health system properly.
All right. Look, I think what we probably are agreeing on, without knowing whether there was any particular motive behind this, is that they need to get their act together in terms of the announcement of their policies, right?
Yeah.
Okay, it's at the very least not a good look.
I think that there is a trade-off between party democracy and being effective as a political party, and I think sometimes that they may have to have a look at that balance.
I think that this probably, over-egging it, saying it's party democracy, because we have seen in the last 10 days a future fund announcement that was completely lacking in detail that Hipkins couldn't answer basic questions on, a forgotten announcement on GP funding, a perhaps announcement we're not really sure on subsidies for gaming, and then today a leak. That doesn't show a problem with the democracy in the Labor Party. That shows a problem with
Two
Hipkins.
weeks ago, everyone was accusing them of not having any policies.
Well, at the moment, they're pretty half policies. So
I do agree a bit of work on the process of announcing policies might be in order.
Well, what they will be wanting assurance about is that this isn't the start of someone stirring within, and we just simply don't know that. If it was due later this week, perhaps it is just, as we said, someone's enthusiasm. Let's come back now to the other story that's happening at the moment, and this is not irrelevant because these numbers are tight for next year's election, right, between left bloc, right bloc. And now Te Pāti Māori, it is understood, are moving towards potential suspension of their MP, Mariamino Kapa-Kingi. We know this controversy that's gone on, the split, also the Toitu Tiriti leader, who is her son. We know we've had information released about issues raised around her. This is really heading for the max when you're talking about suspending a party member. I can think of one or two in my experience, but how worrying for Te Pāti Māori that this is where things are heading at the moment.
Yeah, this is significant because it wasn't just that a possible suspension of Kapa-Kingi, it's also that breaking away from the Toitui Tiriti movement, which is the grassroots movement that has been sort of giving the groundswell behind Te Pāti Māori. You've also seen over the weekend 2 MPs come out with either social media posts or their local electorate committees not supporting
backing
it.
her.
So there is quite a split happening, and I think if you put it in that wider context of, well, what does an alternative government look like? At the moment, you've got Labor coming out today with a policy that's not going to satisfy the Greens. They want a much wider capital gains tax and they want a wealth tax, which has been ruled out today. And then you've got Te Pāti Māori, who seems completely utterly split and has been undisciplined, I think, for several months about exactly what is happening in that party. If you try and add up the numbers, well, actually, how do you get to a coalition? It's looking pretty shaky at the moment for Chris Hipkins.
Yeah, look, I don't know if Te Pāti Māori's woes will hurt them. Their vote seems reasonably impervious to that. It's kind of more based on them being, going hard at the government on Māori issues. But I do think it's catastrophic for Labor and their chances if Te Pāti Māori carries on like this.
Well, also, and this is Wātea News reporting here, thank you for that, that's what we're relying on for some of the decisions that have been made. They're also reporting that there's some afoot who want to move on the party's president, John Tamahiri, for example. So look, that's their situation. But for Labor...
I think they have to try and boost their vote to not need Te Pāti Māori. I think that's the only way through. I think any electoral strategy that relies on Te Pāti Māori being in government and plausibly being seen as being in government, I think that's disastrous for Labor. I just don't see them getting there. And so I think Labor has to shoot for a Labor Green majority. And it's as simple as that.
Ngā mihi nui, thank you both for your time today. That is Neale Jones and Brigitte Morten.